The one thing I've learned working at the National Museum of American History is that food brings people together, but food history brings people even closer. So, if you have a seat next to you that's empty, and you can move over a few seats to the middle and the front, please do so. We have a lot of friends and family coming in for this program. And so what I would ask everyone to do is just quickly stand up, grab your backpack, your briefcase, your purse, stand up, and move closer in. My friends right here in the middle, please stay. If you don't know the person next to you, quickly introduce yourselves. This is about building community. This is the center of what we do at the National Museum of American History. I will point on you if you don't do it. We'll take one more minute. Please do move in to the center. Absolutely. Also, the front are the best seats in the house. The front are the best seats. You can see our great esteemed colleagues. So please do move forward. It allows other people to come in should they come in a little bit later. Please move in and to the front. Okay. That's one way to do it. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back. Our second roundtable of the day is called Selling Regions, and it will discuss how communities, food entrepreneurs, and tourism-related industries sell the concept of a region through food, culture, and economy. A quick reminder about questions. You can tweet your questions to us using hashtag Smithsonian Food, or write them on cards you received on the way in and hand them to the ushers who are on the outsides of the theater. And so do keep an eye out for them. During the last 15 minutes of the discussion, Amelia Grabowski in the back will ask some of those questions for you. Our moderator is Dr. Ashley Rose Young, the historian of the American Food History Project at our museum and my office mate. She's also the host of our live cooking demonstration series. I gotta turn the page. Called Cooking Up History. It's a wonderful program. I do hope that you will all come tomorrow to see some of them. And it's part of our food exhibition curatorial team. Ashley, please take it away.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Selling Regions. It is an honor to moderate a panel with such outstanding scholars. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to take a few minutes to introduce our panelists before framing the discussion, and then we can get into the nitty-gritty of Selling Regions. Our first panelist, Dr. Jennifer Dweck, is the Stephen A. Jaroslawski Chair in the Modern History of Middle East and North Africa at the University of Manitoba. Her research deals with the 20th century cultural and political history of the Middle East in a transatlantic context. Dr. Dweck is the author of numerous academic publications, including her book, The Claims of Culture at Empire's End, Syria and Lebanon under French Rule. Her current project on food history traces the globalization of Middle Eastern cuisine and examines how producers and consumers conceptualize, write about, and understand the Middle East in an international context. Dr. Jessica Harris is the author, editor, or translator of over 17 critically acclaimed books documenting the culture, especially foods and foodways, of the African diaspora, and specifically she'll be speaking about New Orleans today. An award-winning journalist, Dr. Harris has also written in numerous national and international publications, ranging from Essence to German Vogue. She was invited to curate the Sweet Home Cafe at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and is also a member of the kitchen cabinet here at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Dr. Lucy Long directs the Ohio-based nonprofit Center for Food and Culture and is an adjunct professor at Bowling Green State University. Dr. Long researches and writes about food and its role in constructing, performing, and negotiating meaning, identity, community, and power. She focuses specifically on Southern Appalachia and the Eastern Midwest. Her critical works of scholarship include, but are not limited to, the following very topical books: culinary tourism and regional American food culture. Dr. Amy Trubeck is a professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Sciences at the University of Vermont and the faculty director for its graduate program in food systems. Her research interests include the history of the culinary professions, globalization of the food supply, the relationship between taste and place, and cooking as a cultural practice. And today she'll be focusing primarily on New England and the Northeast. She is author of many scholarly works, including her book, The Taste of Place, A Cultural Journey in Terroir. Thank you, ladies, for joining us today. And so now I want to take a moment to frame the discussion through a personal anecdote. But first, a primary question to consider. How do certain foods become emblematic not only of a city or region, but also the people of that region? I am from the city of Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh has been on all of our minds recently. And one of the things I love so much about my city is its food culture. And in the fall, I can't help but think about tailgating food culture. So in my hometown, one of the most popular tailgating foods is pierogies. And these are delicious boiled dumplings stuffed with potato and or cheese, pan-fried in butter, and then served with sour cream. Or at least this is how we do it in my family. Pierogies have become so iconic in Pittsburgh sports culture that nearly every stadium in the city serves them. At PNC Park, the home of the Pittsburgh Pirates, pierogies are no longer just a stadium food. Pierogies have actually become Pittsburgh mascots. So in between the 5th and 6th innings at a baseball game, PNC staff members will dress up in giant plush pierogi costumes, and they will race each other around the baseball diamond, all the while fans are cheering for their favorite, pierogi, whether it's Potato Pete, Jalapeno Hannah, Sauerkraut Saul, among other thematically named characters. I would like to point out that I have proudly brought with me to Washington, D.C. my pierogi race t-shirt. So if you want to see that later, let me know. But the pierogi's popularity in Pittsburgh has really stretched far beyond the stadium. You can now find pierogi-themed clothing, earrings, dishware, you name it, in local gift shops. So pierogies have become, far more than just a food. They're really emblematic of the city itself. They have become an icon of how people identify with the city of Pittsburgh. So I want to think about this idea. How does a food become so powerful, become so symbolic of a region? So during this panel, we will explore how local entrepreneurs, tourism boards, and larger industries develop and shape popularized regional foods like Pittsburgh's pierogies, and how locals and tourists alike respond to those emblematic foods, embracing them, rejecting them, influencing them. So now after that, I would like to turn things over to our wonderful panelists, and I'm going to ask Dr. Lucy Long to get us started. Let's bring this back to regions. Let's bring this back to the importance of food. Help us get started in this conversation, Lucy. What are your thoughts on regional foods and how we sell them?
Okay, well, this could be a full week of, of all of us talking. I want to mention, first of all, even though it is the food history weekend, I'm trained in ethnography as a folklorist, so I'm looking at contemporary meanings and uses, which is very relevant. So when we talk about, we being folklorists, talk about regional food, we're talking about foods that are reflecting the history of a people and groups of people interacting with the physical environment within a specified geographic region. Each one of those elements can be dynamic, amorphous, and vague. Okay, so one of the first things to remember is that regional food is something that's very fluid, it's very dynamic. People are manipulating those boundaries, for different purposes. So one of the other things I think is very important is we're dealing with people's perceptions. So if people perceive that they are of a region and that their food is representing their region, they're going to treat it differently than if they do not have that perception. So how do those perceptions get created? Okay, part of how we talk about region is that it's a differential identity. It's based on contrast. Okay, so when I was growing up in North Carolina, I didn't realize that grits were something that was Southern. And when I moved, I think I was 8 years old, and I moved away, and people said, "Ooh, what are you eating?" And that suddenly made me realize this food represents a different place. I am different because I eat that food. One of the things that makes talking about regional food so complicated, though, is that food also represents place. It doesn't have to be just differential identity. It also represents place. Okay, and there's a geographer, philosopher, Ifu Tuan, who talks about the concept of topophilia, okay, love of place. Okay, so that through food, you can start acquiring memories and associations with that place, that make you love that place. So, and you're not thinking necessarily that, oh, it's different from other places as part of a big cultural region. It gives you that love of place. Okay, and then region as a construct that's being used commercially or whatever, ends up, there's an interplay between that love of place and region.
Dr. Harris, do you think you could tell us a little bit about, I'm thinking about the city of New Orleans and the kind of pride and passion that people living in that city have for their food culture.
Oh, wow.
Can you kind of explain to us or give an example of a dish that is so important to that region's local identity, but also to their kind of tourism industry?
Certainly the classic dish would be gumbo. I had it all set up, and now I'm looking at a picture of my girlfriend's newborn. So clearly, technology has
Very
already
cute.
begun by going awry. But think of gumbo in New Orleans. Think of New Orleans as a city in the United States where arguably, if anyone is even remotely considering traveling there, the first thing that they do is reach out to folks and say, okay, where do I eat? What do I do? Where do I go? New Orleans is a city that has festivals, and I'm going to read you just a partial listing of them. The Andouille Festival, the Boudin Cook-Off, the Cracklin Festival, the World Championship Gumbo Cook-Off, the Treme Creole Gumbo Festival, the International Rice Festival, the Southwest Louisiana Black Pot Festival and Cook-Off, the Louisiana Pecan Festival, the Pecan Festival, the Sugar Fest, the Funktoberfest, the Shreveport Brew, and the Bayou Beer Fest. And that's not a complete listing, but when you start to think about that, you're really beginning to think about all of those food associations that New Orleans and arguably southern Louisiana, Shreveport is kind of off that map, have for people internationally, not just nationally, in terms of food. So I think that that's one of those things that is a lure, is a draw, and that brings people there.
Amazing. Now I'm thinking about New Orleans. Oh, my second home, next to Pittsburgh. Amy, I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about a particular product. So we've just talked about festivals and celebrating a local culture through New Orleans' very robust festival culture. But what about artisans and producers who might focus on a particular product? How do they kind of bring a region and a regional identity into their product to kind of promote their businesses and their self-identities?
Yeah, so there's many ways to sort of think about this. So I thought I'm going to have two examples, and one of the examples, there are other people on the panel who might chime in and may disagree with some of my explanations. So I'm very interested in the relationships humans have with their natural landscapes. A lot of the work that I've done has been in rural agrarian landscapes. I think urban landscapes are extremely interesting and fascinating about place, and as the Pierogi example, New Orleans examples are great. But in rural places, the people have created livelihoods and identities around the way in which they interact with the natural world, and they sort of take advantage of or extract or sort of bring the conditions or limits of a natural environment and try to nurture that towards making food and drink that then becomes iconic of the region. So the very typical one in New England is maple syrup. Now, apparently, it's also important in Canada. So it's a very interesting issue. Maple syrup, I think, brings up all of the ways in which we can create a kind of bounded identity. That's sort of my place, of my region. But food and identity escape place all the time. So factually, maple syrup comes from a certain tree. It's called the Acer saccharum. It's the particular maple tree that has a sweet sap. It grows in the northern forest. The northern forest does not respect state or national boundaries and decides to exist in Canada and in the United States, though it's very interesting. You do not find Acer saccharum trees in Japan or in Poland. And actually, I have some really interesting issues about the Japanese interest in maple syrup, but that's another for another day. But so maple syrup is, I think, a really interesting story about understanding the relationship of food and place, and also taste and place, because it is absolutely particular to it's a wild food that comes from a tree that just grows in a particular set of environmental conditions. And it is also a continuous tradition beginning with the Abenaki. It's certainly a situation, as people were talking about in the earlier panel, there was a lot of know-how and a lot of investment in this particular product before settler colonialism happened, or capitalist colonialism. So it has this very interesting long history, and it has been of place, and it has to be of place in a sense, because you can't actually have that product made somewhere else. But as I was pointing out, for example, I live in Vermont, and we have the best maple syrup. Like, there's no question. I just want to put it out there.
We have an objection.
It's best. It's the best.
We're having exclamations from the audience. Maine is the best maple syrup.
Lucy is talking to me about Ohio, and I'm just not sure. I will give Canada some credit.
I was going to bring a Voyageur belt because in Winnipeg, Manitoba, where I come from, we have a winter festival which happens in -20, -30 Celsius. Sorry. Where one of the activities is, of course, rolling maple syrup on a bed of snow. Maple syrup gets poured on the bed of snow, and you roll it up, and then you lick this lolly, shivering in very cold weather outside. And Winnipeggers come out for this year after year. And maple syrup has nothing to do with Vermont.
I don't know. I think those are fighting words.
Well, it really has
And
nothing
I
to do
think
with
this
New
notion
Orleans.
of identity, I do think food, I don't know, this is why food is so fantastic to talk about identity and place, because it's visceral. We have visceral responses, but also we have personal experiences that are in the place, and we can't really let it go. Like I can't really give it to Quebec, you know. I can try, but I can't do it.
So why with Ohio, Lucy? Why don't we associate Ohio with maple syrup? What happened there? Or why was maple syrup, why has it become such an iconic product of what we think of as the Northeast, or going, that border shared between the United States and Canada?
Right. Well, and people in Ohio are wondering the same thing, and not particularly happy about it, because it's kind of a pioneer tradition. That's how it's presented there. And there's a lot of maple syrup production, and they have maple syrup festivals. And maple syrup producers tell me that they actually ship a lot of their maple syrup to Vermont.
That's true.
Well, and I think this is a really good example of how there's an image of a place. Ohio doesn't fit that image of those romantic winters and all. And Ohio's bland, boring. It's part of the flyover region. So it doesn't really have an identity. Or that's the perception.
I was going to say, maybe the Ohio Tourism Board would have something else to say about that. But it's, there's these perceptions that Americans or visitors to the United States have of particular states and regions. And they're shaped by tourism boards, they're shaped by locals and visitors alike, but that is a dynamic that's constantly changing. And even the people living in those places may not have control over that particular narrative. So there's these power dynamics at play. And I would definitely think in the history of the US South, thinking into the 19th century and the early 20th century, the people who have access to publishers, to publish cookbooks, or to share recipes were predominantly white, privileged individuals. So in the South, we
You're
have
looking
these,
at me?
who knew, right? No, so in the
so
South, we have these
surprised.
issues, the politics of regional identity shaped by predominantly white publishing houses.
Well, I mean, I think even you don't have to go back that far. I think that still occurs. I mean, people are given access, if you will, to publishing certain kinds of things, and certain kinds of things are expected of them. But in terms of the South, if you go back, and I'm going to sort of be like Othello and the handkerchief, and I'm going back to New Orleans, and I'm going back to the old cookbooks, the Christian Women's Exchange, 1885, one of the early New Orleans cookbooks, compiled by Christian women. By the way, those of you who go to New Orleans, that's the Herman Grima House, is the Christian women. But using mainly Creole, large quotation marks, recipes. Lafcadio Hearn, La Cuisine Créole, same year. But again, you still find those recipes. Now he's using the term Creole. You get to the Times-Picayune Creole cookbook, and in the first edition, or the second edition, because the first one is so rare I haven't even seen it, but in the second edition, you see an African, large quotation marks, mammy figure with a tureen of arguably gumbo as the frontispiece. So that there is a very clear awareness of where it comes from, but a complete, well, not complete, an unwillingness to admit whose large quotation marks, because that's sort of an argument that we probably have to save for another day, but whose food it is, or who is even preparing the food. The introduction does talk about over 200 years. This kind of food has been prepared in New Orleans by African chefs, Creole chefs, under the tutelage of their white mistresses. I don't think so. So you get all of that that's tied up and braided into that conception of the food that is iconic for a city. You can't go into a restaurant in New Orleans, or most sort of traditional restaurants. And there again, a whole history of restaurant tradition that goes back. I looked up some dates. You've got Antoine's 1840, Galatoire's 1905, and Arnaud's 1918. That would be the Creole trilogy, if you will, of classic restaurants. But what happens is those restaurants, and then the newer restaurants that claim to be serving New Orleans food, there is always a gumbo. There is always a gumbo. Basically two traditions, two trends. The more Côte des Allemands, German coast one, Cajun, arguably quotation marks, which would be the mahogany roux. The roux is the color of mahogany. And you've got duck andouille. The doyenne of African-American Creole cookery, Leah Chase, has been known to say, and I am paraphrasing her, don't hold me responsible, the Cajuns would eat anything. Creole gumbo was different. We are ticky about what we put in our food. And the Creole gumbo, the roux isn't as dark. It may have, it probably will have shellfish or shellfish usually, crab, or something of that sort. And so you've got these two traditions, but it's always about the gumbo, and it's always about the way that it is served, and it's always about all of the different parsing outs, if you will, of those nuances. The other thing that's interesting is the Southern Foodways Alliance has established a Gumbo Trail, which I have not been on, but which must be interesting. But the whole idea of how the notion of what is a gumbo pretty much changes almost block to block, almost in the same manner that in New Orleans, the definition of who and what is a Creole changes darn near from block to block as well. So lots of things to think about.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that, and it made me think of Lena Richard, one of the first African-American chefs to publish her own cookbook based on New Orleans cuisine, called New Orleans Cookbook, and this is in 1939. So as Jessica mentioned, you have these early Creole cookbooks, 1885, but it really isn't until the 20th century that you're going to have examples of cookbooks authored by African-Americans who have been preparing this cuisine since the colonial period through generations, fusing all of these cultures together. And her work is an amazing example of entrepreneurship and of that history and of that taste of place. And she self-published it originally, but in 1940.
She was quite the entrepreneur.
She was
not only
amazing. I can't
self-published
help
it,
but
she
bring
worked
her
with
up. I
Father
had to bring her
Divine
into
to
the
get the book
conversation.
sold. She was arguably one of the first people to have a television show. She had a television show on the air in New Orleans in the 50s, early 50s. I mean, one of the very, very early things. Lena Richard is quite someone in and of herself. But equally, if you go all the way back to the book that was for many years considered to be the first African-American cookbook, which is the Abby Fisher, What Mrs. Fisher Knows About Southern Cooking, in that she also has a Louisiana inflection. So you see these things as they move onward and ultimately out into the world.
Thinking of this concept of kind of diaspora and diasporic cooking. And so we've been talking about this within the African diaspora, but I'd like to shift our focus a little bit to Jennifer's area of expertise with the Middle East and how Middle Eastern cuisine has been perceived both, in Europe, in the Middle East, but also here in the United States. Can you tell us a little bit about that and the transformation of Middle Eastern cuisine in our understanding and what products are so key to this particular kind of diasporic culture?
Thanks. Speaking of cookbooks, there's, I think, a parallel path where Middle Eastern women are involved in publishing and get into the publishing industry. Publishing houses like Doubleday, and Knopf, which are such important cookbook publishers. And there is a small set of Middle Eastern women who, in the 60s and 70s, publish Sonia Uvezian, The Cooking of Armenia, Claudia Roden, who will be known to many in this room, Neshat Eren, The Art of Turkish Cooking, or Delights from the Topkapi, playing with Orientalist themes which have power dynamics which say you can't present yourself, sell your region. If you're an Arab or Middle Eastern woman, you can't sell your region to an American audience unless you are orientalizing yourself, unless you're being exotic and sort of the belly dancing. Yes, exactly, this male Western gaze. At the same time, these women are also subversive. They're subverting that Orientalist gaze. They're not accepting that they are just these exotic figures presenting exotic delights to a very Western audience. And one of the ways that they do that is they come back to place. And this comes back to, Amy, what you were saying about terroir, which is that the recipes, what they anchor their recipes in is the fact that these recipes have particular flavors that are associated with not just this big amorphous region called the Middle East, but with particular cities, with particular springs. So they tell stories about how when they were children, they had to go and get water from a nearby spring, but they couldn't go to the spring that was 10 minutes away because the water didn't taste as good there as the spring that was half an hour away. And if they brought back the wrong water, they would be scolded by their parents within minutes and by their grandparents. Or if you ordered a peach, but you didn't specify whether it was from Izmir or from Bursa, you were really letting down. You were not living up to the demands of connoisseurship. And so one of the ways I think that these women in the cookbooks subvert this sort of power dynamic of Westerners looking at Arabs is that they really attach the flavors to very particular places and they don't let go of it. It's something that they really hang on to.
Can we explore this idea? We keep tiptoeing around the term terroir, and I'm wondering if one of you, maybe Amy, can define terroir for us. And what is that? Why is that so important? We keep seeing this taste of place come up. Why does that matter?
Okay, sure, I can give that a shot. So you can understand terroir as the idea that there are unique sensory properties of certain foods because of the natural environmental conditions under which they are produced. So there is going to be, for example, a cheese is going to have a certain kind of sensory quality because of the kind of cow, the breed of the animal, but also the grasses that the cow eats that gets translated into the milk, which then becomes part of the cheese. Water is actually super interesting. There is a lot of groups of people and places where they feel that the water itself will make a difference. I don't know if you know that in beer, actually, there's a sense that the water makes a difference in terms of the taste of the beer. And there's that, but the other idea about taste of place that's really important and is kind of coming through in all of these discussions is that it's also a form of cultural know-how, so that there's an idea that people from a certain place have this particular relationship to that place, but they also have the cultural know-how to make the gumbo a certain way or to make the pita a certain way, and that it's a combination of a set of natural conditions and cultural priorities that sort of makes a taste of place. And then I just want to put a plug in at the end is that I think one of the reasons why taste of place is so powerful all over the world in a lot of ways is at the end of the day, we eat food. It is symbolic, it is cultural, it is political, but we also eat it and we experience it through the sensations in our mouth. So we experience it through smell, through taste, through flavor. So the sensory elements and sensory uniqueness, I think, is a really important way that people can kind of create their sense of identity because they have something special. So Ashley's relationship to the pierogi and my relationship to pierogies in Pittsburgh is going to be quite different. I'm going to be like, hey, great, that's pierogi. And she's like, no, 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 you do not understand. You have to get the pierogi from this place with this cabbage in this way. And she'll have a whole way of discernment where she's going to talk to me about those pierogies. I love that, so I'm going to come with her. But I think that is the very interesting difference between an internal sense of identity and taste of place and then being a person who wants to, in a sense, be given that opportunity to have that sensory experience.
Well, if I may, I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated because I am clearly the oldest person on this panel by a long stretch. But I'm also the person who was doing what we're now calling food history before it was a discipline. And I'm hearing the discipline. I started my career as a French teacher. Terroir, lovely French word, terre, dirt. It grows in the dirt. Basta. You can think about things like Creole tomatoes. Creole tomatoes, other places are tomatoes. But when they grow in the dirt of that area, they become Creole tomatoes, and they do have a different taste, they do have a different texture, they do have a different way of being. And I think we're also talking about, in that sense, and perhaps because I know Claudia Roden, it's always connected in some way with storytelling. What we're not really thinking about is that link between the tale told and the taste consumed, and those ties. And I think that's also a part of what makes for the place, that way of telling the place, but of telling the place through its taste as well. So that I think that whole idea of memory and storytelling and then locus, specific spot, is a part of this whole idea of terroir.
Thank you for sharing that. Lucy, it seems like you have a follow-up to
add that?
Jessica's
Yes.
point.
Part of the reason I think taste of place is so powerful right now is that place seems to be something that is kind of apolitical. So anyone can go to a place and participate if you have enough money and free time. So anyone can go there and participate in this. So it seems like something that's very open and can then unify us and then can be used to create region. Obviously it's not nearly as apolitical as it seems, but I think that's part of the power and part of the power of regional foods in general. That they seem to be something that everyone can come to this place, be a part of this region. It doesn't matter what your religion is, your ethnicity or your race. You can always travel through and eat in those restaurants. So I think that's part of why it's become so powerful. So even though marketing and tourism is always trying to find, some hook, this is a hook that resonates with people, and it's fulfilling a need that people have to feel a sense of connection to place, but also to feel a part of something larger.
I think it does, but with a caveat, if I may. And I think the caveat is participate in it how? As a participant observer, or as an observer? And I think when those lines start to blur is when we get confusion and discord, actually. So it's the thing that is the lingua franca that then can be totally dividing in its other way.
This question of participants, I think, is very important it's not just the people who are involved in selling, but also big corporations in terms of the selling part of this, that there can be little communities who have their little traditions, and my Mennonite background gives me all kinds of culinary traditions. That doesn't get onto a larger scale that is marketed more widely unless there's a big industry or company that is interested in doing that. And the Mediterranean, for instance, as a region, became a thing to sell because modern science began to say that olive oil was heart healthy, and
the olive oil board.
The olive oil wars, absolutely, and so this then became a thing that was to be sold, and so we get the International Olive Oil Council that is launching all sorts of ads and promoting itself, and olive oil campaigners are now selling the authentic Mediterranean diet, so backed up by modern science. There's an interesting arc, the peak of the science is toward the end of the 80s, and then as there starts to be competing nutritional information that's coming out toward the end of the 90s, one of the olive oil ads that ran by Bertolli in the late 90s, as Bertolli was realizing that the Mediterranean diet wasn't becoming so clear-cut as a health benefit, they ran an ad saying, and there were sort of dueling nutritional pyramids, they ran an ad saying, if changing health claims are hard to digest, remember why you chose olive oil in the first place. So this sense of connection to place only gets marketed and sold on this wider level, where it's no longer the people themselves. It's no longer the Italians, the Arabs, it's no longer the women in their kitchens that are really part of selling. It's big corporations, where at this time it's mainly men who are making these decisions, and men who are not probably from these backgrounds.
Indeed.
Amy.
Yeah, I want to say that I think that understanding regional cuisine and regional foods and the taste of place is very important and interesting to think about in a historical sense. In the contemporary setting, the reason why I think there's so much interest in foods of place and the taste of place is because we have this increasingly extended global food chain, whereby the relationship a producer can have to place and their identity about what makes a unique product can actually be completely and utterly different than the consumer. And there's more and more sort of intermediaries, like, publicists and businesses and all that. And that, like, for someone like me, I'm just fascinated in how something like olive oil or maple syrup can have so many different meanings for so many different people, and yet it still has to get extracted from the trees, and it still has to kind of it has to come from that place. It isn't at this point able to be anything different, just like I can't get coffee from Vermont because there are still limited environmental conditions that says coffee has to be grown in the same altitude. And this is just a little story of the way in which you can have such a difference. There are over 2,000 sugar makers in the state of Vermont, and actually maple syrup is increasingly in demand. And there's more and more market demand for maple syrup, and so more and more people are actually tapping more and more trees in the northern forest because there's actually more demand than there is supply. And I was talking to a major person in the state about, like, what is happening? Why is there so much interest? Why does everybody want maple syrup now? This was about 5 years ago. And he said, well, first there's this thing about how nobody wants high fructose corn syrup anymore because they're freaked out by it. So now all of the processed food, cereal, and granola bar companies want to say that they have maple syrup because then consumers will buy it because they'll feel like it's a natural sugar rather than high fructose corn syrup. And then this guy, the person I was talking to is this sort of northern Vermont, sort of salt of the earth, certain kind of Yankee guy, said, and then there's Beyonce. And I said, what? And he said, Beyonce. And I said, well, why is it Beyonce? So it turns out that about 5 years ago, Beyonce went on a cleansing diet, which was, it's a 2-month cleansing diet, and it's maple syrup, cayenne pepper, lemon juice, and water. And she tweeted about it and put it on social media about how great it was, and she'd gotten this really great syrup from Vermont, and she was on this cleansing diet, and I guess her beehive went crazy.
Beehive.
And there was this huge spike in maple syrup consumption. And I just was like, this is the modern world, you know? It's like, anyway, I find this to be the sort of fascinating thing. I mean, the people in Vermont, as of right now, are still making maple syrup the exact same way, pretty much, that they have been for 50 or 60 years. But consumers are sort of circling around it in so many different ways.
Lucy, did you have a response?
Things like movies, also fried green tomatoes, which now we think of as iconic of the South and the Southern Appalachian region. And every upscale restaurant in that area is now doing, fried green tomato and grit stacks, So, and that apparently, it did not become popular until after the movie in the 1970s, fried green tomato. So, and it was something that home economists in the North were trying to get people in the South to eat as a healthy alternative to meat. And there were editorials like, these Yankees think we'd eat that kind of thing? So the power of popular culture is incredible.
This is amazing. So through our discussion today, we've talked about influence coming from producers themselves, consumers, Queen Bey herself, tourist industries. There's so many players shaping regional food cultures and how we understand them. It is so complex and dynamic, and we're so happy to have your perspectives on this. So I wanted to actually open up the conversation now to our audience here. Please pass your questions to the aisles, and we'll collect them. And if we have any questions from Twitter for our wonderful panelist, Amelia, we will be happy to take them now. I don't think your mic is working right now, so it's hard to hear you.
No?
Yeah,
No.
Oh, there we
go.
go. There we go. We have lots of great questions from Twitter. Some folks are commenting on the language of speaking about the human relationship with the natural landscape, but agriculture isn't always natural, it's man-made. Is there also spinning a concept of natural to market the region and its food and drinks?
What was the last?
I didn't understand.
What was the last part of that?
So, some of our Twitter followers have been commenting on the language of natural versus the man-made and industrial, or not industrial. This is what happens when I try and paraphrase Twitter. Some of our Twitter followers are commenting on the use of the word natural and wondering if that's being emphasized to marketplace as opposed to focusing on the industry of creating food.
Well, I think when we're using natural, we're talking about the physical environment, not necessarily organic food, which is what a lot of people would use natural to represent now. So we see food culture in general. It's always this interaction between what is in the environment and the humans that are settling and adapting that. And some cultures try to be closer to the physical environment than others. I'm not sure that answers.
Jennifer?
I think one of the selling points, actually, of many regional, certainly in the Middle Eastern cookbooks, the connection to place often gets conveyed by an idea of, I slaughtered the lamb myself, and there's something very natural about slaughtering the lamb yourself, and I picked this fig myself, and I went to the spring and I got the water myself, and so I think that I think there's some parallels also with how regional cuisines get portrayed, because they're seen as connected to land, and if they're connected to land, they must be natural. So in that sense, I think the word natural reverberates in this territory.
Those are interesting categories too. I'm thinking about certification for organic, for example, and even some of the barriers that can be in place for small producers who may not be able to actually have access to these boards, or there might be barriers in place where they may be organic or they may be, quote, natural, but they're not able to get the certification either. So it's making me think again about these power dynamics that you see, especially with local producers versus these kind of larger industries, whether they're trying to be certified organic or whether they're going up against really large corporations who are mass producing particular products. There's a lot of conflict embedded in these kinds of production and the consumption that we partake in as consumers of maple syrup, maybe going to the producer themselves or buying maple syrup at our local grocery store. Those are very different products, and there's a lot of power imbalance in play there. Are there any other questions from Twitter?
There are, and there's some great questions from our audience. In fact, one goes right off of what you're saying on maple syrup. Also, there's a maple syrup debate raging on Twitter right now. Yeah. So with the example of maple syrup that you would buy in the grocery store versus from another producer, what role does class play in people's ability to access the taste of a place?
Well, I think it's, the notion that there are things that are made in certain regions that are sort of specific to that region doesn't necessarily have to have a relationship to class, in the sense of, if you have land or you have a relationship with somebody with land that has the maple syrup, a grove of the trees, you can get the maple syrup and produce it for yourself for no money, in the sense of it's a wild food, like you just extract it and then you boil it down. So it isn't, if you are in the landscape, you can have a relationship to that food in the landscape that can be not necessarily related to like a market economy. It's for certain kinds of foods, for sure. Then once a food becomes symbolic or iconic of place, and it becomes to represent something that is bigger than one person's immediate relationship to slaughtering their own pig for their dishes in a Middle East town, then it can get very implicated in issues of connoisseurship and authenticity and ideas of social distinction. So I think one thing that I'm really interested in, reason I'm very interested in regional foods in general, is that everything can be happening at the same time with one food. It can be all and nothing in relationship to something like class.
Do we have a question from the audience, perhaps, that we can answer?
I do. So we've talked about class. This question is about race and ethnicity, with the example of pierogies, that they aren't just a Polish culinary tradition. They're emblematic of the city of Pittsburgh and tailgating and culture. Pizza and spaghetti are no longer Italian, they're American, and in the regular aisles of the supermarket, whereas other foodways, specifically Thai food is used in this example, remain in the ethnic aisle. And the audience member wondered if you could comment on which foods get to be sort of the regional hallmark and which don't.
Which foods
Get to be a regional hallmark in a place.
Oh.
Yeah, that's good. That's interesting.
I can.
Go ahead, Lucy.
So there's an important important distinction, I think, between foods that are being promoted as being distinctive of that place. So you can only get maple syrup, real maple syrup in Vermont.
That's right.
You heard her say it.
And then there are foods that are regional, but they're representative of the region, meaning that you can find these foods in other places, but they somehow embody the history, the identity, the feel, the terroir of this place. So I see that happening with apples in the eastern Midwest, Michigan, and Ohio and Indiana, which nationally we don't think of that area as being a place for apples. However, they do grow a lot of apples and produce them. Johnny Appleseed was in that area. So that's something that's an organic symbol of the identity there that people there are embracing. And then the festivals are now bringing people. There's actually the grave of Johnny Appleseed. So now people are starting to flock there to see apples. Even though if you want to think about where's the best apple produced, well, probably Vermont again, or Oregon, so it's a very complicated, fluid
Right.
process.
I also wanted to comment, we had a wonderful chef come in for one of our live cooking demonstrations, Cooking Up History, named Chef Edward Lee. And we brought him in to explore the South as a region. And this is a region that we might typically or stereotypically associate with grits or gumbo or fried green tomatoes. But the point that Chef Edward Lee so aptly made was that these cuisines are not static. The cuisine of the American South is not what it was in 1885. There has been layers upon layers of migrant communities coming into the South internationally and also nationally, influencing its food culture, shaping it, bringing in different ingredients. And Chef Edward Lee is Korean American, and he fuses his Korean culinary traditions with Southern food cultures to create new dishes that are now appearing on what he calls his neighbor's table. So he says, you may be in Louisville, Kentucky, you may be in New Orleans, Louisiana, and you see that a Vietnamese migrant might be making pho, for example. And in so many years, that pho will no longer be classed as exotic, right? It's going to be part of the everyday culture. This is the part of how our cultures develop over time, and there's a consequence sometimes to selling regions, right? To bring this back to our panel, that when you sell a particular region, you almost make it static when you identify key foods. Even with gumbo in New Orleans, it is constantly changing, but there's an idea that gumbo is only X. But we know that gumbo is changing all of the time. So in selling regions and taking into account these larger migrations, we have to realize that our food cultures are not static, and they're constantly being shaped by new migrants coming into the United States. So I'm glad that we were able to talk about that a little bit. Do we have maybe one more question before we wrap things up today?
Yes, we do. We've moved on from maple syrup to gumbo. And someone on Twitter asks, how do you feel food manufacturers are handling regional duplications of food, such as gumbo or other regional favorites?
How manufacturers are handling it?
Yes.
Well, when I was growing up, there was always a Campbell's soup that was called chicken gumbo. Okay? It had absolutely nothing to do with anything I've tasted in New Orleans. Arguably might be a little like a Charleston gumbo, except my friends in Charleston would kill me for saying that. But I think the whole question is the name. Okay, sort of T.S. Eliot, the naming of cats. The name may be more popularized, but the taste definitely, usually does not go with the name. So that I think that as the name becomes known, I assume, I don't know, but back in those days, sort of antediluvian, like me, if you had partaken of the Campbell's chicken gumbo and suddenly found yourself in New Orleans with a gumbo, it would have been an enormous surprise. So I think that that whole idea of the larger institutions may popularize it. And I think in our now food-centric world would probably be a little more nuanced and a little more focused than certainly the Campbell's Chicken Gumbo. But I think even then, it's a come back down to the, okay, what's on the table? You know, what's on that real table? And with the extensions of menu and recipe and what can we call it? The whole repertoire of foods that is growing with new inventions, new people coming in, new chefs. At some point, it behooves people, perhaps, to think about what that matrix was. There are certain foods that people are happy to adapt. Bœuf en croûte, bœuf bourguignon, all of that. There is a standard. I think particularly with foods of the African diaspora, because it comes out of an oral tradition, because it comes out of a tradition that has a link to enslavement, people assume that there are no standards. And so if I call it a gumbo, it's gumbo. But what makes a gumbo specifically? And that should be defined by the people who made the gumbo. What makes a gumbo? What makes an étouffée? What makes an all of those things? As yet, we have not come up with, certainly in African diaspora, la housse gastronomique, or for that matter, an American la housse gastronomique. What are the things? What are those definers? And I think that that's a point that then becomes a bedrock off which you can embroider. But we are kind of losing that bedrock as well.
That is, oh, Lucy, go ahead.
I have an anecdote that fits in with that. The Atlanta History Center right now has a wonderful exhibit on barbecue.
Yeah, I was an advisor.
This is an exhibit that they started planning about 15 years ago, and they were asking all the local famous barbecue people throughout the South. Well, finally, they asked me to come in. They said they needed someone who was an outsider, who was not invested specifically in a local place, because no one would agree on even what the definition of barbecue itself was. So part of what we're looking at here is that everybody does give different meanings to these foods. So how do we recognize those meanings, yet also think of a place in a broader sense? So we have this balance going back and forth from the commonalities to the differences.
Well, on those wonderful concluding points, I want to thank our panelists for this amazing roundtable discussion. I think we all have food for thought as we head to lunch, but I'll turn things over to Adam to wrap things up.
Thank you. Thank you to our moderator and our panelists for that conversation. Please join Dr. Jessica B. Harris and Dr. Amy Trebek in 1 East, where they will be signing their books. We will break for lunch now, and we'll meet back here at 1:30 p.m. I have a special announcement to make, and that is to let you know that the members of the new editorial collective for the journal Gastronomica, the Journal of Critical Food Studies, are here and would love to speak to you or anyone who's interested in a potential manuscript or has an idea for an essay or a food-related topic. Dan Bender, Amy Trebek, and others, please raise your hand. There they are. They are here to talk to you over lunch, so please do find them. So please join the editors and the roundtable participants for lunch and our Stars and Stripes Cafe in the lower level, 1 floor down. Look for the specially marked seating for Food History Weekend attendees. Yep, that's it. Thank you.